CEO and co-founder of DLA Knight. With me today, I've got Michael Solomon, and we're going to be talking about his book, The New Chameleons: How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. Michael, welcome to the show. Where can people find you, Michael?
Well, I have a website, which is just michaelsolomon.com, or good old LinkedIn. You can look me up there as well. And email is just michael@michaelsolomon.com. Very
excellent. And what I was doing some research for this show, and it said you've written 30 books.
Something like that, yeah.
It's just awesome.
Well, it didn't feel like it at the time, but
because you've written textbooks, haven't you? And
yes, many of them are textbooks.
Yeah. So your new book, which is this, I mean, I've read it, and it's so now.
Oh, thank you.
In terms of the what I would call business to consumer, so to direct to consumer, and the way that we are buying has changed.
Oh yeah.
You tell a great story in the book about how someone who was looking for a prom dress, 20 years ago, would go down the mall and see one in a shop, and now, of course, you go online and you research, you share with your friends and say, "What do you think?" and then you go along and you take selfies. The whole thing is dynamic. It's changed so much, isn't it?
Yeah, and you really did read the book. I'm impressed.
I just happened to click through it, and I found that piece, and I'm just got lucky, mate.
There you go. It's ironic. This internet thing was supposed to make our lives a lot easier and more efficient. And the example you just shared is a great one of how it works the other direction. A lot of people are working a lot harder today to buy everyday stuff. They're just researching it, to the extreme. But that's the way we work today.
So question. I think I know the answer. Do you think that the modern consumer has changed?
Oh, how haven't they changed, or we changed? We've seen enormous changes. One thing I need to be clear about is, some people seem to think that COVID changed our lives, and it certainly did. But what I like to point out is that, other than maybe fist bumps or something like that, a lot of the big disruptions that are going on in the marketplace we're starting to percolate well before COVID. What COVID did was basically to throw some fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
But just about any big change that we might see, something as basic as a lot more people shopping online for groceries, for example. That's something that the last few years, the pandemic had definitely accelerated that. But we were already seeing that movement beforehand. So, we've definitely seen huge changes. Obviously, have to do with technology, but others have to do with very profound changes in our culture and the way we think and one another. So, it's tempting just to point the finger at the internet and say that's changed everything, but that's only part of the story.
And do you think it's when we go online and we buy stuff? Are we going online to express our identity? Is that what we're doing? And when I'm talking about that from a consumer's perspective rather than a business to business perspective.
Yes, of course. Almost everything we buy is an expression of our identity. And frankly, this is where a lot of brands miss the mark, because they just don't think in those terms. They're thinking about functionality, which is fine. But the reality is that in today's marketplace, we assume that most of the brands in a category are probably going to work okay, reasonably well. Yet there are always a few brands in any category that are just light years ahead of the rest in terms of popularity. And a big reason for that is they're not really just selling functionality. They're selling a story, and that story, more importantly, has to relate to the consumer story. It can't just be a fun story. It has to be a story that somehow instructs us that we could make an improvement in our lives, or we could make progress on some journey that we're undergoing in terms of our identity and experiences. And that is clearly what separates the wheat from the chaff when it comes to brands.
I know when I read the book Shoe Dog by the CEO of Nike, it's a fantastic story of how he set the company up, and it's a page turner because it's nail biting, but ultimately it's a brochure because it's a top of the funnel. You know what you're doing. You know, at the beginning of it, I'd never thought about buying Nike. At the end of it, Nike is now part of my. You know, I need to look at Nike because he seems like a really good person, and his heart's in the right place. So Nike has come on to my shortlist.
Yeah, well, I think
story.
Every exposure to a brand should be a brochure in a sense, but the challenge is not making it look like one.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. It's a story, which
exactly.
It's a fascinating book on business. But that's and it must have. You know, if you're someone who loves Nike and you've read that book, you're just going to love them even more, aren't you?
Sure, of course. And Nike is famous for having its stories, and my understanding is they even have people who are appointed as corporate storytellers to initiate new employees, into the legacy of Nike, starting with making the shoes in a waffle iron in his kitchen and so on. You're right; it is a great story, and that's exactly what we want when we're looking for shoes or anything else.
So, categorization of buyers and what I would call ideal customer profiles. Do you see that has changed? I mean, you talk about in the book. I think you open up straight away with like page 3 or something with this definition of this individual, which goes into so much detail.
Right.
Whereas normally we go, well, they've got to be divorced. They're probably female. Right. They're over 40, which is what we did 10 years ago.
Right. Well, let's be clear. I mean, in a sense, this hasn't changed. Our ability to fill in those blanks has changed because we know so much more, for better or worse. We know so much more about our customers. But when you look at the art and practice of psychographics, where you do want to supplement those demographic data, age, gender, and so on, with lifestyle stuff. This is something that's been going on, well, at least since the 1950s, if not earlier. The big difference is how we're doing it, and I think the recognition among more marketers that this really is essential. To your point, it's not enough to know that someone is 50 years old and divorced. We need to know why they were divorced and whose fault it was. What we need to know the details and how that corresponds to other things going on in their lives. So really, the urge. It's one thing to describe your customers. It's another thing to categorize your customers. And that's where we run into trouble, because we do have a natural tendency to want to put things into categories and assign them labels. That's the basic way our brains work. In fact, it's very adaptive, because if we didn't assign those labels and we had to start from scratch making sense out of every single message or product we encounter, our brains would just explode. We just don't have the capacity for that. So we assign things labels. By the way, Tim, I'm picking up an echo on my end. I don't know if it's...
Are you? Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm not at this end.
Okay. Just so you know. I'm not hearing it anymore, but it was. Yeah. So anyway, it's great to describe and you want to add flesh to the bones and to understand your customers' lived experiences. The downside to that is when you assign them some kind of a label because it's convenient to do so, and you don't go any further than that. And furthermore, you assume that everyone who's been assigned that label must be reasonably similar to one another. Now, that's the basis of modern day mass market segmentation, and that, basically the book is set up to kind of debunk that. it definitely was an effective approach for many, many years and revolutionized the practice of marketing. And mea culpa, I teach it to my students. Segmentation is the backbone of marketing. But here, you know, in the day and age in which we live, it no longer makes a lot of sense. And frankly, it's no longer necessary, because we do have the ability to pretty literally think in terms of markets of one. That is, each of your customers is in a way their own market. Now, you want to, of course, find some similarities at some point. But the reality is we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. It's definitely not perfect. But by knowing what people have done in the past, it gives us a much greater insight into what they're likely to do. And so those descriptions, those details are really, really important in an age where it's not only brands that need to tell a story. Each of us as consumers, we're trying to tell our story, and we're using the brands to do that. So in the old days, I think people, there was much more of a dominance submission kind of relationship between brands and customers. The big brands pretty much told you who you were going to be if you used their product.
Marlboro Man and
yes, of course,
yeah.
Yes, a Jolly Green Giant, anybody you can imagine. You know, every celebrity that was ever paid $1 million. But what we're seeing today is it's not that brands aren't important. It's not that young people hate brands. They love brands, but they use those brands far more preemptively. They're much more like hunter-gatherers. They find the brands that are going to be part of who they want to be and that story they want to tell. And part of that story is going to have something in common with other people, you know, their age, et cetera. But part of it's going to be very individualized and customized. And that customization is probably the second most desired attribute of a brand message today. The first being, how am I giving back to the community, and how is my story related to sustainability and that sort of thing? So between those two things, you know, brands that are responsible stewards and tell that story, and the desire to have that personalized brand experience, I think that captures a lot of what consumers are looking for from brands today. And it's quite different than it was back in the heyday of segmentation back in, say, the 50s and 60s.
You talk about linear and non-linear decision making. What do you mean by that?
Yes, it's funny. You know, we've done research. Colleagues have done research for 50, 60, 70 years on how people make decisions and how we change attitudes. And again, it's based on certain assumptions about the way people are operating. And so the traditional model that almost every student of marketing learns, they may not remember it, but they've learned it, is that we follow this very predictable linear path as we're making a decision.
Yeah.
Which means that you don't make a decision overnight. It's a process. You know, first you have to become aware of the product. You know, and the classic AIDA model, awareness, interest, desire, and action,
yep,
is still very valid today. So it's a recognition that there's a process going on here. The problem is that it's not straightforward as it used to be, where we would, for example, be alerted to that we had a problem in the sense that we need to buy something, we're out of milk, or I need a new prom dress, as for your example. And then that instigates the problem-solving process. We might go out and read consumer reports or something, finally make a decision, and then get feedback from our limited network. Today, that feedback loop is operating 24/7. So we're no longer learning about products on an as-needed basis. We're learning about them in a constant stream. And that means that we're often being alerted to things that we didn't know we wanted because influencers or others in our network have brought them up. And that means it's a much more circular process, where a lot of customers, and you know, your opening example about the amount of work that it takes to buy a prom dress or something else, consulting other people, doing online research, checking YouTube videos, and whatever it is you feel you need. It's an ongoing, non-linear process. and it relies much more heavily on feedback from your tribe or your before the fact rather than after the fact. And actually in the book, I refer to this kind of thinking as the hive mind, kind of actually an oblique Star Trek reference for anyone who knows Star Trek. But what we see is that a lot of kids today, and some older people too, are need to validate everything before they make a choice. They need to validate that meal that's just put in front of them at a restaurant. They have to upload that to Instagram or Snapchat and get approval. I've had students tell me that they didn't know that their boyfriend or girlfriend had broken up with them until they read about it on Facebook. It's that kind of public airing of what used to be a very private decision-making process that is so drastically different today. And quite honestly, Tim, most marketers, especially retailers, have not figured this out yet.
You talk about, one of the things you talk about in the book is social shopping, which is what you're saying. And because the term about social shopping, people, you go to Instagram and you see an ad for something that's going to sort out your grass, and you go, $15. I mean, I might as well buy it, and you buy it, and then you find it doesn't work. But what you're talking about in terms of social shopping is the fact that your people are going to a shop, Primark or TK Maxx or whatever, and then taking a photo of it and uploading it and saying, do you think I should buy it?
Right.
And then putting it on, and then taking a selfie, and then probably going out and so there's this, and as you say, part of that is validation, and also part of that is the fact that we now live in a world of networks, so we kind of expect our network to. But where is this going to go, do you think?
Well, I'd like to think that people are going to retain control over their autonomy and, in terms of knowing what they like. But, and of course, the pendulum swings back and forth. Back in the old days when I was, in college, that was in the last century. Electricity had just been invented. It was very exciting. We had
the wheel had just been invented.
Yes, the wheel was starting to build.
It's just coming in. Yeah.
We had sayings like "do your own thing" and don't trust anyone over 30, and everybody's an individual, and of course they weren't, because we all wound up looking the same, trying to be individuals with our tie-dye jeans, etc.
Yeah.
But at least there was a focus on the value of individuality. I think the pendulum has swung in the other direction now, where there's an emphasis on collective value. It's almost like an Asian perspective. If we keep going, in traditional Asian cultures, the maintenance of face, looking good to your group, et cetera, is paramount, at least in traditional societies. And we seem to be ironically moving more in that direction, even as the Asian cultures are swinging more toward the Western school of thought and focusing more on independence. I think that one thing that may be an issue is with all the influencers out there. I think they're going to be poisoning the well, because the reason we deferred to them was we perceived that they were objective, that they could evaluate. There's just way too much product information out there for us to evaluate anymore. So we rely on these intermediaries in the channel to be what we call cultural editors, to narrow down our choices. However, when we find out that these big influencers, are being paid by company X to do that, obviously that erodes their credibility. And so what are we seeing now? A lot of brands are looking for so-called micro influencers, less than, say, 10,000 followers. And so the irony is that for years, you built your market value as an influencer by gaining as many followers as you could. What we're seeing today is that it's more of the micro influencers, just like some of the micro brands have much more loyal followings. Now, they don't have the numbers, but they have the passion, and they probably are spending quite a bit more on those niche brands per person. When we talk about lifetime customer value, than the people who are the more casual shoppers of the big brands.
Yeah, I think that there's some I read recently that there's anti-influencers. on TikTok or something like that. And so, but you know what it's like. It's wheels within wheels. It's
Yes.
There's always going to be you know, we're gonna quiet quit or we're gonna loud quit. It's much of the same thing. But yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think with influencers, a lot of it is people don't see the difference between me coming on here and saying that you've got a good book because I like it, and coming on here and me coming on saying you've got a good book because Kogan Page has paid me. By the way, they haven't paid me, but but you know, it's and a lot of people don't see the difference in that, do they?
No, they don't. You know, unfortunately they've learned to take things at face value, and you know, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And
as Abraham Lincoln said, if it's on the internet, it must be true.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, he was one of the first influencers.
Back
in the 1860s. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, you know, a lot. Well, I've done a lot of work in my career on with the fashion industry, and I tend to look at these things as a fashion phenomenon, and the pendulum swings in fashion, right? And the way we receive information is affected by that. So we can see that with the latest, you know, social media platform du jour, you know, whether it's TikTok or Snapchat and, you know, Vine. Well, no, they're closed. Now we move on to the next one. So
it's funny how Vine was short form video, which Twitter bought. Everyone's going to go into short form video. They bought it, then nobody did it, and then all of a sudden TikTok arrives and everyone's into short form video.
Right. Yeah, it's partly it's a question of being in the right place at the right time. And
yes,
you know, one of the biggest I mean, I guess the two biggest problems are either one, being too late to market, but two, being too early to market. And lots of innovative marketers have run up against that wall. The consumers just are not ready. You know, we economists tell us that consumers will always go for the easier option or the more efficient one. But that's just not true, because if it's something that they're not prepared to accept, you know, for example, years ago, you know, they tried to introduce, you know, these hair removal products for women like Nair. You know, they said, well, that would be great for men. I mean, you know, it's such a pain to shave every day. They can just apply this stuff and their facial hair will fall off. Well, that's true. That would be a more rational choice for men. How many men have done that in their lives? Probably zero. So we're not as rational as the economists like to say. I'm a psychologist. I'm more in that camp. You know, we do crazy stuff, but often there's a reason. It's just that the reason is not apparent to us immediately.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book, The New Chameleons. I'm assuming it's available on Amazon worldwide.
Yes, it is.
And thank you so much. And it's, as I said, it's I just sent you a note because sometimes I forget, but I've just given you a 5-star review on Amazon and Goodreads as well, because it is, you know, it's a great book. And I thank you so much for coming on and talking about it. You know, I really enjoyed getting into it. And where can people find you?
Well, again, I'm just at michaelsolomon.com. Or on LinkedIn. Those are the two best places. And if anyone wants to reach out with a question or anything, or again, it's michael@michaelsolomon.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on today, Michael.
Well, thank you for your insightful
question. It's been a great chat.